So I'm pleased to present to you Sean Maegher, who is the coordinator at Convene, or the convener at Convene. And he was also the former executive director of Social Planning Toronto, and just someone who knows a little bit about everything that's happening in Toronto and a lot about housing in Toronto. So,
am I good there?
Yes.
Great. Hi. We're the last show of the day. Second last show of the day. Last panel of the day. The last panel of the day. And we're going to talk a little bit about municipal assets and municipal land and how municipalities can do a good job deploying their assets to make things work better. Generally, I want to take a look at what we've been doing as a municipality, how we've been using our assets, how successful we've been at that work. Oh, shoot, just a sec. How successful we've been at that work, what tools we have to do a better job, and how we can deploy those tools a little bit more successfully. When we look at how we've been doing building affordable housing in Toronto, an obvious thing to look at is the Housing Opportunities Toronto plan of 2010, a 10-year plan to build 10,000 units of affordable housing. Here is the 2019 report on how we did on the Housing Opportunities Toronto plan. I think by any measure you have to say it was a pretty complete failure. We scheduled 10,000 units of affordable housing. We built 4,093. One year we didn't even get 50 units of housing out the door. And in fact, the two years that we did best, 2011 and 2012, were years when federal and provincial stimulus money to counteract the recession were being spent. So those were really actually large-scale public investment moments that were anomalous in the Housing Opportunity Toronto plan. And aside from that, we banged out about 250 units a year of the 1,000 that we were planning to try to achieve. So that didn't go terribly well, and part of the work that followed in the middle of that was about 2015. There was a decision to try to leverage some new components to the Housing Opportunity Plan, in particular by engaging the market. Let's get the for-profit developers more engaged in creating affordable housing by extending incentives, fee waivers, development charges exemptions, to enable them to build more affordable housing. The tricky part about that were a couple of things. One was that they, of course, were for-profit developers, so they were trying to maximize their profit while they were doing it, so they wanted the shallowest affordability available. So these were units at 100% of the average market rent. And they wanted to make some money off them in the long run, so they were limited to 25 or 35 years of affordability in most cases, making them only temporarily affordable to try and get us closer to that goal of 10,000 units of housing. And of course, if we look at the period from 2015 to 2019, we don't see a lot of growth there. And in fact, the only real growth we see is in 2019, and a lot of that is including probable projected development from a whole separate program that got folded into these statistics. So far we're not doing great. And in fairness to the people who are delivering this strategy, the Affordable Housing Office, they've been pretty clear and pretty public about the fact that they also recognize that this has not been remotely successful as a way to create more affordable housing. All through the process of that, there was a lot of criticism of the Housing Opportunity and the Open Door program, and we heard a lot from City Hall that they recognized that they weren't doing enough, but it really was the best that they could do, until all of a sudden they decided that they could do better, and then they did. The Housing Now program got launched in 2019, and suddenly we applied more tools. They weren't new tools. They weren't tools we didn't have in 2015 or 2014 or 2011. They were just tools we weren't using. And we tried using them. And in particular, what we did is we applied a lot more public land to the task of creating affordable housing. We also lowered, we made the affordability levels deeper. It was 80% of average market rent was what they rented for. And we made the durations better. We went from 25 to 35 years to 99 years, which is pretty close to permanent. And we used that to try and build, to plan to build about 3,000 units of housing. So we had more tools. When we applied those more tools, we were able to achieve or at least plan for better outcomes. The problem is that the correlation between what we're doing and what we need to be doing is not fantastic. We're building at 100, we're creating units that are at 100% of average market rent or 80% of average market rent, and where we have our serious crisis in this city is at about 40% of average market rent, which is roughly what you get on social assistance for your shelter allowance. About 40% of the $1,000 a month that it costs to rent an average market rent bachelor. And we need permanent affordable housing, and we need about 100,000 units of it, because right now in Toronto, we have about 100,000 people waiting for deeply affordable housing. About 2 years ago, we crossed that line to be the first time in history when we had more people waiting for affordable housing than in it. And so now we have that as our target. So we're not even shooting for any of the things that we really need to accomplish, which is a bit of a challenge. And it's a challenge that lots of people confront, and lots of people recognize that sometimes there are problems that are bigger than you are. Sometimes there's only so much that you can do, and you try and you do your best. And to figure out whether or not you're actually doing your best, because we weren't under housing opportunity in Toronto, we could have done better with housing now. It's a good idea to look at what your opportunities really look like. What are the assets you have? What approaches would work better? And what kind of choices can you make? So let's look at some of those assets. The city has a lot of assets. Under housing now, we're using about 40 acres, about 170,000 square meters of land to create about 3,000 units of affordable housing. Well, what else do we have that we could do that with? Well, we have Build Toronto, now Create Toronto, that has about 500,000 square meters of land that we could be using to build, even at a fairly minimal density of about 2.5 times coverage, about 14,000 units of housing. But we don't have to just stop at the way the city has historically defined surplus land. We normally think of surplus land as land that's just not doing anything substantive. But there's a lot of land that we have that's doing something really useful, but could also be doing more. We have rec centers. We have about 250,000 square meters of rec center floors all over the city of Toronto. If we built on top of those at a modest density of about 2.5 times coverage, we'd get about another 6,000 to 7,000 units of affordable housing. I have a bunch of green P lots that people are parking on. We intensified those even at for most of those, you could build them at 5 times coverage, but you could get 1,000 units of affordable housing at just 2.5. We have libraries that are mostly a story or two tall that could easily provide another 6,000 or 7,000 units of affordable housing. We have a lot of TTC land, about 500,000 square meters that we're not using fully. We have EMS stations at about 750,000 square meters. We have a bunch of daycares. And we have Toronto Community Housing, which has about 1 million square meters of land, a lot of which is actually providing affordable housing right now, but a lot of which isn't. And if you just maximize the effectiveness of the land that isn't providing affordable housing right now, there's another almost 14,000 units of affordable housing that you could build. City has another about 4 million square meters of land that they're using for various kinds of things. And if you just assume that about a quarter of them could be built on in any way, there's another 23,000 units of housing. So we have actually enough land right now available to us to build about 100,000 units of affordable housing. We're just not using it because we're not defining surplus land in the way that most effectively provides for housing. And when we look at that land, we have to wonder, so what's the best approach to get that land developed? And that key asset could be deployed a lot more effectively. The Housing Now and Open Door model tried to incent the market to fill the affordable housing gap. But is the market really going to do a great job of that? How well is the market suited to that task? When we look at permanent affordable housing at about 80% of market, here's a fairly standard pro forma from an affordable housing provider in Toronto that looks at where the revenue has to come from to be able to provide a unit of affordable housing. Small, a bachelor is going to cost you about $250,000 to build. And where can money come from that makes that work? Well, if you're going to be able to provide it at about 80% of market, then you can only carry a mortgage of about $80,000 for that unit. That's only about 30% of the cost of creating that unit. So if you use the open door tools, there's another $40,000 there. If you use the CMHC co-investment fund, you can get about 40% of your capital, but you can only do that if it's owned and operated by a nonprofit. So the for-profit sector can't access that. And when they access capital dollars elsewhere, they pay a significant premium that grant recipients don't have to pay to get access to capital. And there's other monies like Section 37 that can help to bump that up. But about 70% of the cost of building that housing has to come from outside of what you can get in terms of a revenue stream if you make that housing even moderately affordable at 80% of market rate. And if you look at what the market actually builds, it's pretty challenging to get them into that space. A new unit of affordable housing, sorry, a new unit of rental housing tends to get built and rented out at about 140% of market because the average market rent includes a lot of older, mostly suburban, comparatively run-down apartments that are below market, and new fancy stuff that is, not surprisingly, above market. The HOT plan brought us rents at about 100% of average market rent. Housing Now is bringing us rents at about 80% of market rent. At about 60% of market rent, you start to get to the point where you're basically just covering your operating costs, and you can't really afford much of a mortgage at all. But what we need is a whole bunch of units at 40% of average market rent. How the market is going to fill that space between what they're building now at 140% of market and 40%, which is what we need, is a tricky puzzle. And that's why, and this is one of these two different slides I stole from Deanna, why we have some of the problems that Deanna pointed out earlier, why we have rents that are skyrocketing at a rate higher than they have for 15 years, why we have almost half of the people in the Toronto paying more than 30% of their income on housing, and why only about 2% of new rental housing is in the affordable range. And here's another map that I also stole from Deanna that shows where it is in Toronto that people are paying more than 50% of their income on shelter. And what's interesting about that map is if you remember Deanna's other map of where we're building housing right now, there's a high correlation. The dark green areas where the most people are paying 50% of their income on rent are also the places where we're building fastest, where the supply is growing fastest. So if we think that somehow supply is going to solve this problem, we have a map that shows us the data that says, no, supply is not solving that problem. And in fact, where we're getting supply, we're building exactly the wrong stuff. So it's not helping in terms of affordability appreciably at all. So what are the alternatives? What do we do if we have this problem where the market can't do it because the gap between what you can make money on and what we need is so huge? What can we try to do? So the provincial government's laid out its analysis last week. They made it pretty clear that they think that unlimited private supply is going to be the solution, that if we can unchain the private market and it can build and build and build as fast as it possibly can, sooner or later, the laws of supply and demand will mean we'll have an oversupply, the price will fall, and everyone will get cheaper and more affordable housing. To do that, we have to build at a rate that creates such a glut of housing that that housing gets sold off for substantially less than it costs to build it, which means we have lots of people going into bankruptcy. And we need private developers who do no analysis on absorption rates, private developers who do no analysis of their markets, and accidentally build so fast that they all go bankrupt and we all get cheaper housing. That's option one. Option two is the Housing Now model. The Housing Now model basically says, let's use the assets we've got. We can turn them over to the private sector. They will build private market housing. They will make so much money doing it that they can transfer some of that to make about a third of the housing affordable. And that's essentially what Housing Now does. It gives those 40 acres of land over to private developers. They develop them, they make a lot of money, and they subsidize some of the units out of that. To get to there, to get to 100,000 units, though, we need about a 3-to-1 ratio, which means 300,000 new homes built on public land. We don't have 300,000 new homes worth of public land, and building 300,000 new homes is about a decade's absorption. It's a Mississauga and half an Etobicoke. So to scale to that point is pretty daunting. The third option is a little arcane. We invest public money to build things that we need as a community. Either as directly owned and operated municipal housing, or we invest in nonprofits to build affordable housing, or we can also invest in the private sector to build and operate affordable housing. The catch is that that's not the goal of private housing developers. And so in the US, where they've done a lot of that, in particular through inclusionary zoning, they incur a lot of costs around compliance and monitoring, so you have to jack up the cost of that model to cover the cost of that compliance monitoring. This is, though it is somewhat arcane and somewhat quaint for a lot of people, the most successful model to date. We've built a whole lot more housing by investing public money in creating the housing we need than we've been able to build any housing any other way. The challenge, of course, is that people will say, and they've said it to me on Twitter when I say this kind of thing on Twitter, people will say, you can't do it. We can't afford it. There's not enough public money. We can't levy those kinds of taxes. There's no source of revenue to pay for all of this. And that's a difficult empirical question that we should take a look at. So what's our capacity to invest? Well, we've decided to build a Scarborough subway instead of an LRT in Scarborough. That, though there is not at this point really any solid, reliable estimate, is somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion of extra money going into that choice that we made as a government. That's about 8,000 units of affordable housing. We've decided to put the Gardiner Expressway on stilts again instead of on the ground. That's about $1 billion or 4,000 units of affordable housing. At the beginning of the last term of council, council hired KPMG, notorious socialists that they are, to go and have a look at what kind of revenue we could generate if council were to use the powers that council specifically asked the province of Ontario to give it, enabled to bring in the revenues to do this sort of work. And this was their answer. Their answer was that with the alcoholic beverage tax, the entertainment tax, the vehicle registration tax, a parking levy, road pricing, and tobacco tax, all of which the city has the power to do, we could raise as much as $1.2 billion a year. That's another 4,000 units of affordable housing a year. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our property tax rates, which are the lowest in the region and continue to be a huge gap between what everybody pays in, say, Mississauga and what we can afford to do here. So how do we get here? If we have revenues available, if we have spending that we could be spending on affordable housing, if that would allow us to do the public investment that resolves some of the issues that we're talking about, why don't we have that? And the reason we don't have that is we've chosen not to. The reason we don't have that is because council has decided over and over again either to not raise that revenue or to spend it on other things, on the Gardiner or on resisting the press to create affordable housing publicly using public investment. Thank you.